There's a moment in many men's lives when they realize something unsettling. They aren't just reacting to the world around them, they're absorbing it, not like a radio antenna picking up signals, but more like a quiet seer standing at the edge of a crowded marketplace. Everyone else is bartering in noise and movement, but he is feeling the undercurrent, the tension in a stranger's jaw, the disappointment behind a partner's silence, the resentment no one is naming. And for years he may have assumed this was insight, intuition, even a gift. But here is the first uncomfortable truth most empaths never question. What feels like spiritual sensitivity often began as survival, not wisdom. Many men learned this sensitivity long before they had language for it. As boys, they grew up in homes where moods shifted like weather fronts. A caregiver's sigh could predict a storm. A slammed cabinet door meant retreat. They learned, quietly, resourcefully, that tracking other people's emotional states was safer than revealing their own. Hyper-attunement became a shield, not a virtue. And while that shield protected them then, it later turned into something far heavier, the belief that they must manage the atmosphere around them in order to feel safe within themselves. Jung would say that when a powerful psychic function remains unconscious, it doesn't make us gifted, it makes us obedient to an archetype. Many empaths fall into the roles available to a child who learned to keep the peace, the martyr who absorbs every burden, the savior who rescues before being asked, or the good son who exists to soothe rather than to be known. These roles feel moral, even noble, but they quietly drain agency. They build a self around service rather than sovereignty. And then culture enters the picture. Modern spirituality, self-help, and entire corners of social media celebrate the intuitive empath with a kind of reverence, but rarely with clarity. The praise often masks an invitation to self-abandon. Be endlessly understanding, endlessly forgiving, endlessly available. The empath is framed as enlightened for carrying what others refuse to hold. What goes unspoken is the cost. He becomes a magnet for those who feed on emotional labor and offer little in return. This is why so many empaths describe relational patterns that feel baffling in retrospect. They become the repository for other people's unresolved chaos. The confidant, the container, the emotional absorbent pad in relationships marked by gaslighting, idealization, and devaluation, and cycles that mimic intimacy but deliver exhaustion. Loyalty becomes measured by how much pain they can hold rather than by whether the relationship nourishes them. And inside that exhaustion, they often misinterpret depletion as devotion. There is also a biological layer, one that has nothing to do with destiny or weakness. Mirror neurons and oxytocin wire us for resonance, connection, and bonding. But when early trauma shapes the nervous system, resonance becomes vulnerability. Oxytocin, the hormone often associated with closeness, begins rewarding over-responsibility. Men in this position frequently confuse manipulation for magnetism because their bodies respond to intensity as if it were intimacy. It isn't stupidity, it's conditioning. All of this creates a strange existential tension. The empath senses everything, yet often locates himself nowhere. He can read the emotional weather of a room within seconds, but struggles to articulate his own needs, his own direction, his own boundaries. He feels others deeply, yet loses the thread of his own identity. Some men describe it as living behind a thin veil, present but blurred. But here is the turn, the axis of this entire journey. Individuation for the empath is not about becoming less sensitive. It is about pairing sensitivity with spine, discernment, and symbolic authority. It is about shifting from unconscious absorption to deliberate presence. Jung would say, it is the moment a man stops serving the archetype and starts acknowledging his own center. If you want a symbol for this transformation, imagine the battlefield medic who never left the front line. Even after the war ended, he kept tending to everyone else's wounds, stitching them, carrying them, absorbing their panic. He forgot that he was allowed to step back, pick up armor, and claim command of his own terrain. Many empaths live exactly like that medic, competent, compassionate, deeply exhausted. So as we begin this exploration, hold this simple orientation. Nothing in you is broken. What feels like dysfunction is often an old survival strategy, working too hard and for too long. What feels like intuition may be unhealed vigilance, and what feels like destiny may simply be a pattern waiting to be named. Stay with this. At the midpoint, will expose the pattern empaths almost never recognize, the hinge where unconscious suffering begins to transform into conscious sovereignty. There is a moment, usually in a man's late 20s or 30s, when he begins to notice a strange pattern in his relationships. He is often the calm one, the steady one, the one who anticipates needs before they are spoken. People call him dependable, understanding, emotionally intelligent, yet beneath that praise he feels a quiet fatigue he cannot name. And here is the subtle misinterpretation many empaths carry without realizing it. What they think is a mature capacity for care is often a reflex shaped in childhood, long before care had anything to do with choice. For many men, empathy began as emotional currency. As children, they learned that being undemanding or soothing helped preserve fragile peace in homes that shifted without warning. A parent's mood could change the entire climate of the day. A sigh meant caution. Silence meant withdrawal. Raised voices meant retreat. Without guidance, the child became an interpreter of micro-threats. Tone, posture, the rhythm of footsteps, all of it became data. His nervous system was training itself in real time, building a radar that could predict tension before it erupted. What looked like sensitivity was, at its core, adaptation. And adaptation has a cost. Over time, these boys grew into men who equated over-attunement with intimacy. They believed that the more they anticipated, the more they absorbed, the more loyal they were. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, they also adopted a quiet belief that being responsible for others was what made them good. Jung might describe this as the loyal son complex, a part of the psyche that remains devoted to stabilizing the unstable parent, even long after the parent is gone. The adult man no longer sees himself as a son, yet the pattern persists. A partner's distress feels like a summons. A colleague's disappointment feels like failure. He offers steadiness while secretly carrying suppressed fury, unresolved grief, and fantasies of escape he never names out loud. Underneath this loyalty lives another current, fear of abandonment disguised as moral duty. The man doesn't cling out of weakness, he clings out of conditioning. His younger self learned that the cost of not absorbing tension was emotional rupture, conflict, or withdrawal. So he became reliable, predictable, pleasing, and because the strategy worked in childhood, it continues into adulthood, even when the context no longer requires it. Neuroscience provides a sober mirror here. High emotional resonance makes these men exquisitely sensitive not only to distress, but also to approval and disappointment. Oxytocin rewards appeasement, reinforcing the belief that harmony equals safety. This means their intuition is often misread. What feels like insight is frequently trauma-calibrated prediction, a nervous system trying to prevent danger rather than connect authentically. There are signals of this pattern that almost no one talks about, yet they appear consistently in men who grew up hyper-attuned. Notice how quickly apologies arise for offenses never committed. Notice the physical tension that appears when someone withdraws approval. Notice the inability to truly receive support, the instinctive deflection back to the other person. These are not flaws. They are relics of a time when the child had to become the emotional adult too early. And here is a reframing that may feel both unsettling and relieving. This adaptation, while remarkable, becomes a silent invitation. Men who carry this loyal son imprint often attract partners who sense their readiness to absorb blame and stabilize chaos. What appears as instant chemistry is frequently something older, recognition of an emotional battlefield both people have walked before. This recognition shifts the ground beneath the story. The empath is not destined for painful relationships. He is repeating a familiar role. And roles can be examined, understood, and eventually rewritten. Next, we move toward the moment where this familiar pull intensifies most, when the empath meets someone whose volatility feels like truth, whose intensity feels like connection, and whose unpredictability activates the deepest layers of his conditioning. This is the point where many men confuse emotional turbulence for depth, not because they are naive, but because their nervous systems remember what their minds have forgotten. 2 sections from now, we'll test these dynamics against a pattern many empaths repeat, even after years of inner work. There is a particular kind of connection that many empaths describe with startling consistency. It begins with a rush of recognition, the feeling of being seen in a way no one has ever seen them before. For a moment, it feels like the world opens. The conversation is fluid, intuitive, almost fated. But soon, without explanation, the atmosphere changes. Warmth turns cool. Presence becomes distance. Certainty dissolves into doubt. And here is the illusion many men unconsciously hold. They interpret that early intensity as emotional truth, rather than the engineered volatility it often is. Men who speak about these relationships often describe them as revelations followed by disorientation. One moment, they feel chosen. The next, they feel confused. Love bombing mimics soul recognition. Sudden coldness mimics personal failure. Because the empath is conditioned to read emotional shifts as signals of responsibility, he tries to decode what he did wrong, rather than question the structure of the dynamic itself. And this is where the confusion deepens. He begins to mistake turbulence in his nervous system for depth in the connection. A trauma bond doesn't begin with shared suffering. It begins with alternating reward and withdrawal. That rhythm creates a psychological hook far stronger than compatibility ever could. The loyal son imprint fuses with this pattern almost seamlessly. The partner's pain pulls him forward. The partner's distance pulls him inward toward self-blame. The relationship becomes a cycle of chasing closeness and soothing instability, not because it is meaningful, but because it is familiar. What complicates this further is how the body interprets these rhythms. Oxytocin, the bonding chemical, is not a marker of safety. It is a marker of repetition. The nervous system bonds to whatever is consistent, even if the consistency is harmful. Intermittent affection spikes dopamine and cortisol, creating a physiological cocktail that feels like longing, intensity, even destiny. But it is none of those things. It is conditioning. The difficulty in leaving does not mean the connection is profound. It means the nervous system has been trained into a loop. There is a moment in every trauma bond when the empath begins questioning reality. He wonders whether he is too sensitive, too needy, too reactive. He replays conversations searching for the moment things shifted. Yet what he is really searching for is something deeper, proof that the bond is mutual, not mechanical. This search rarely brings clarity because it is aimed at the wrong layer. The bond is not in the meaning of the relationship. It is in the pattern of reinforcement. The relationship may feel spiritual, but the mechanism is entirely psychological and chemical. Here is a reframing that often lands with more impact than men expect. Being unable to walk away is not evidence of love. It is evidence of nervous system entanglement. The impulse to stay is not weakness. It is the body trying to maintain equilibrium within a pattern it learned to survive. And acknowledging that is not shameful. It is clarifying. There is an optional experiment that some men find grounding during this kind of confusion, not as a solution, but as a lens. They ask themselves 3 quiet questions. Does contact with this person steady me, or does it scramble me? Are the reasons I remain based on concrete reality, or on fantasies of potential? If a friend described the same situation to me, would I genuinely believe he should stay? These questions do not break the spell, but they begin to reveal its architecture. Once the spell weakens, another layer of shadow almost always emerges. The empath begins to feel a compelling urge to save, fix, or redeem the other person. Not out of arrogance, but out of the belief that if he can repair the relationship, perhaps the chaos of his own history will retroactively make sense. This is the most seductive trap of all, because it offers a false form of purpose. Yet beneath that purpose lives an avoidance of something far more personal, the grief and rage he has never allowed himself to face. In the next chapter, we move toward that inner terrain, the place where care becomes control, where empathy becomes a mask, and where the desire to heal others quietly shields a man from meeting the parts of himself he has long kept in shadow. This is where the pattern becomes clearest, and where the path forward begins to take shape. There comes a point in the empath's story when the external chaos quiets just enough for an internal voice to rise. It is not loud, but it is unmistakable. It asks a question he has avoided for years. What would remain of my identity if I stopped rescuing people? For many men, that question lands with more fear than freedom, because beneath the calm exterior and the reliable presence, there is often a private belief that their value depends on their usefulness. And this reveals a truth that is both confronting and clarifying. Sometimes empathy becomes a hiding place. Imagine the inner voice of the shadow speaking for a moment, not as an enemy, but as an honest witness. It says, "If I can repair her, then my childhood wasn't meaningless. If I can rescue this relationship, then I was powerful all along." This voice does not come from malice, it comes from grief. It belongs to the part of the man who survived instability by becoming indispensable. That child learned that fixing others was the one form of agency he had. And now, as an adult, he repeats this pattern not because he is selfless, but because he cannot yet bear to sit with feelings he once had no power to express. When Jung described the wounded healer, he spoke of someone whose insight into others grows in proportion to the wounds they avoid in themselves. Off-axis, this archetype becomes compulsive. The man can offer clarity to everyone but himself. He becomes an unofficial therapist in every relationship, the one who listens, interprets, and stabilizes. Others trust him, others rely on him. Yet his own inner world remains structurally underdeveloped. His emotional landscape is familiar, but only at surface level. He knows the weather, but not the terrain. There is a particular form of validation that grows out of this role. The man feels purposeful only when someone else is struggling. If the relationship becomes calm or reciprocal, he feels strangely unanchored. Stability feels dull. Chaos feels intimate. Insight becomes a substitute for intimacy, and emotional labor becomes a substitute for self-worth. The dynamic is subtle, but powerful. He needs someone broken in order to feel needed. And yet, he never names this need aloud because to do so would require confronting the parts of himself he keeps in shadow. A useful image here is that of the silent confessor, a priest who receives every confession but never speaks his own. He hears the wounds of others with compassion, but when faced with his own grief, his own rage, his own unmet longing, he retreats into service. The empath often mirrors this. He becomes a sanctuary for other people's pain, but a desert for his own. Not because he lacks depth, but because depth without direction once felt dangerous. Here is a reframing that often shifts something inside men who carry this pattern. The savior identity is not proof of strength. It is proof of a survival strategy that once protected the psyche from collapse. It gives the illusion of importance while deepening dependence on dysfunctional bonds. And the clues are usually quiet. He notices that he can articulate clarity he rarely lives. He feels resentment when his emotional labor isn't used, yet asking for reciprocity feels impossible. The roles he plays become armor, and the armor becomes home. This is the point where many men sense a threshold. They begin to see that their care is not always care. Sometimes it is control disguised as compassion. Not the authoritarian kind, but the subtle hope that if they can keep someone else stable, they will not have to confront the instability within themselves. This realization is not a condemnation. It is an opening. It marks the moment when a man stops performing salvation and begins defining structure. Because the shift out of this archetype does not begin with becoming harder. It begins with becoming clearer, with recognizing that the instinct to rescue is often a displacement of unspoken grief, unexpressed anger, and unlived ambition. And more importantly, it begins with recognizing that a man's life cannot be built around managing the emotional storms of others. The next chapter moves us toward that restructuring. Not walls, but architecture. Not detachment, but containment. The transition from overextension to inner governance begins with the first quiet boundary. The recognition that saying no is not withdrawal, but alignment. And in that recognition, something long dormant begins to strengthen. There is a moment in the empath's development when exhaustion stops being a temporary state and becomes a message. Not a complaint, not a failure, but a quiet indication that something fundamental in his way of relating is unsustainable. Many men reach this point only after years of giving more than they have, absorbing more than they can process, and extending compassion long after it has ceased to be reciprocal. And here is the illusion that often traps them, the belief that saying no makes them unloving. This belief rarely starts in adulthood. It usually begins in childhood environments where asserting a need was interpreted as disrespect, where having limits was framed as ingratitude, or where emotional independence was punished with withdrawal. Over time, a subtle script forms. Good men do not inconvenience others. Good sons do not disrupt the emotional landscape. and good partners stretch themselves until the other person feels stable. Boundaries become associated not with integrity, but with betrayal. So the man continues to give, continues to bend, continues to soften his own edges, hoping care will shield him from conflict. Yet the cost is profound. When a man sanctifies self-erasure, he eventually despises the exhaustion that follows. He confuses depletion with virtue. He confuses endurance with love. And he wonders why resentment begins to creep into relationships that once felt meaningful. Jung might say that this is the point where the page archetype begins to crack. The page is loyal, dutiful, responsive to every storyline but his own. But as he matures, something inside him begins to shift toward the king, the figure who does not serve every demand, but instead curates what may enter his domain. This shift can feel disorienting. It may feel colder, harder, or even selfish at first, because the nervous system is not used to the sensation of claiming space. But this is where a reframing becomes essential. Boundaries do not reduce love. They refine it. They shape it into something that does not require self-abandonment to sustain. Some men explore this transition through very small experiments, not as acts of rebellion, but as tests of nervous system tolerance. One example is introducing a slight pause before engaging emotionally, saying something like, "I can speak about this tomorrow," or allowing a brief decompression window before responding. These subtle shifts create a new internal signal, presence without self-sacrifice. The purpose is not to withdraw from others, but to observe how the body reacts when it is no longer rushing toward rescue. What emerges from these micro-adjustments is often surprising. There is discomfort, yes, a tightness in the chest, a flicker of guilt, a sense of stepping out of an old skin. But beneath that discomfort, clarity begins to surface. Not a numbing, not detachment, but a more grounded awareness of what is actually happening in the relationship. The man begins to see which connections respond with respect, and which connections reveal themselves to be transactional the moment he stops absorbing everything. And then something even more significant happens. As the empath establishes boundaries, energy returns. Energy he thought he had lost to age, responsibility, or emotional fatigue. But it wasn't age. It was overextension. This renewed vitality is one of the earliest signs of individuation. The recognition that life force returns when a man stops leaking it into dynamics that do not support his growth. This stage marks the crossing of a threshold. No longer a sponge, but not yet a flame. Identity begins to shift from reaction to direction, from managing atmospheres to shaping them. The empath begins to sense the possibility of a different kind of presence, one defined not by absorption, but by inhabiting himself fully. In the next chapter, we explore this metamorphosis in depth. The empath's evolution from unconscious absorber to conscious reflector to something far rarer. A man whose sensitivity becomes a form of inner fire, not because he hardened, but because he aligned. Every man who identifies as an empath eventually reaches a moment when he senses that something inside him is changing. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, like a tide shifting in the dark. Emotional atmospheres that once felt overwhelming begin to feel different, not because the world has softened, but because something within him has begun to reorganize. And here is a quiet truth that many men overlook. Growth in an empath rarely appears as intensity. It often first appears as spaciousness. In the earliest phase, he lived like a sponge. Everything around him seeped inward. Other people's moods, tensions, disappointments, unspoken resentment. He absorbed it without question. To him, this was simply reality. He believed this absorption was empathy, but it was really survival. He treated emotional tension as weather he had no choice but to endure. His sense of identity became reactive, shaped by the emotional climates of others. And even when he suspected something was off, he could not imagine another way to move through the world. But then, at some stage of inner work, therapy, or simply fatigue, he begins to shift into a different mode, the mirror. This is the first conscious phase. Instead of absorbing emotion, he begins reflecting it, not aggressively, not defensively, but with contour. He can sense someone else's anger without mistaking it for his own. He can witness disappointment without collapsing into blame. He begins to articulate boundaries without feeling cruel, The self he once lost in others becomes more distinct. This phase can feel strange at first. Many men describe it as feeling less intense, less spiritual, or even less connected. But this reframing is important. The reduction in intensity is not regression. It is maturation. It is the nervous system learning to differentiate between information and identity. It is the psyche rediscovering the edges it was never allowed to form. And this differentiation, though subtle, becomes the groundwork for something far more powerful. Eventually, a new presence emerges, the flame. Not a flame that burns others, but one that illuminates the man himself. This is the phase where he stops revolving around the moods of others and begins emitting his own values, his own standards, his own direction. Sensitivity becomes selective rather than automatic. Empathy becomes intentional rather than reflexive. The relationships in his life begin to recalibrate. Some people rise to meet him, others drift away without conflict, because the dynamic that once sustained the bond no longer exists. This is not defiance, it is sovereignty. A helpful image here is that of a musician who has spent years in the orchestra pit. From below the stage, he contributes to the atmosphere, but remains unseen. Then one day, he steps out of the shadows, instrument in hand, and joins the center of the stage. He has not changed his craft. He has changed his position. He is no longer background. He is embodied intention. That is what it feels like when an empath becomes a flame. His presence shifts from reactive to generative. He stops waiting for cues from others and begins moving from an internal compass. People respond differently. Situations feel different. The man himself feels different. And yet, the metamorphosis raises a question that cannot be avoided. Now that he is no longer absorbing the world, what will he create within it? Sensitivity without direction dissolves into fatigue. Sensitivity with purpose becomes leadership. Empathy without boundaries turns into depletion. Empathy with structure becomes discernment. These shifts gather into something resembling masculine authority. Quiet, grounded, principled. Not dominance, not distance, but coherence. What remains now is integration. Not another strategy, not another identity, but the weaving together of every stage he has walked. The sponge he once was, the mirror he became, and the flame that is beginning to form. In the next chapter, this integration takes its full shape. As this journey gathers into its final form, a clearer image of the empath begins to emerge. Not the man who once lived as a battlefield medic permanently stationed on the front lines of other people's emotions, but a man who has begun stepping back from triage and returning to his own terrain. The medic who once believed his only value was in stitching wounds now starts constructing something he never realized he was allowed to build. An inner field hospital governed not by hypervigilance, but by deliberate command. What takes shape here is not a new personality, but an integrated one. The loyal son who once oriented every gesture toward earning stability. The man whose devotion inside trauma bonds felt like proof of loyalty rather than evidence of conditioning. The savior who offered clarity to others while neglecting his own inner landscape. And the evolving self who moved from sponge to mirror to flame. Each of these fragments now settles into a fuller picture. Not a flawless man, but a coherent one. Awakening in this sense is not the adoption of hardness or emotional indifference, it is the emergence of structure. Boundaries become less about creating distance and more about defining shape. Empathy becomes more discerning, more principled, more aligned with truth than with reflex. The man no longer organizes his identity around chaos. He no longer lives in anticipation of other people's storms. Instead, he becomes a guardian of his inner dominion, steady enough to feel, clear enough to choose. This marks a deeper shift. Sensitivity becomes a masculine resource rather than a liability. Once decoupled from childhood compensations, it transforms into something rare, a tool for leadership, for discernment, for cultivating stability in himself and in the spaces he inhabits. The empath who once dissolved into others now stands among them with a presence that does not waver with every emotional tide. But this path is not about eliminating wounds. Jung never claimed that individuation was the removal of what once harmed us. Instead, he saw it as a change in relationship. The man moves from identification to stewardship, from I am fractured to I direct my regulation and response. Wounds become part of the architecture, not the architect. And as this integration settles, something else becomes visible. What he once interpreted as deficiency is revealed as endurance. What he once judged as oversensitivity becomes evidence of a nervous system that carried too much, too early, and still refused to collapse. This realization brings a quiet dignity. The man does not arrive at perfection. He arrives at sovereignty. If this exploration resonated with something in you, even a single thread of your own history, you are not alone in it. Many men walk this path silently, believing their patterns signal unraveling rather than awakening. Sometimes, one sentence is all it takes to help another man recognize himself. If this traced something true in you, leave one sentence below, just a signal of the pattern you recognized. That single line may help another man realize he's not unraveling, he's awakening.